The Chinese are an incredible nation, but why are they incredible? Even when there seems to be no hope for wealth and prosperity in their own lifetime, they continue to strive. Why? For the next generation. This is the root of the Chinese nation's hardworking and brave nature. Westerners might give up if things don't work out, thinking that the next generation will find their own way, right? What does it have to do with me? The Chinese are different. They follow Confucianism, which is highly concerned with the next generation. Even if there is no hope for oneself in this lifetime, one continues to fight for the next generation, rolling up their sleeves and getting to work. You don't need to tell them, they think about working hard every day on their own, do you understand? Why will you need to call them to action? The livelihood of the people is endowed with vitality because this characteristic of the Chinese nation, this national character, is there. I have a cleaner in my house, and I see how hard he works. He works for 4 families every day, and after a short rest and a meal, he moves on to the next house. Then when he comes to my house, he always finds me working at my desk because I have to prepare lectures and write articles. He observes I work hard too. I tell him I'm like a cleaner as well, with deadlines for classes and articles to submit. He says, "You're a university professor, how can I compare with you?" I tell him it's the same, but then I ask him, he's over 60 now, 62, and he's been working as a cleaner in Shanghai for many years. He says almost 20 years. I ask if he has saved enough money, not that he has become wealthy, but just saved enough. Has he built a house back in his hometown? He says he has. I say, so the house is all set up, then you can retire, don't work so hard. He replies that he can't retire because he has 2 sons, the first has graduated from college, is married, and has his own family, while the second is still in college. How can he stop now? Both sons need to marry and have children, I add. Hearing that he still has a son in college, I am deeply moved, and then I realize that I am the same. Aren't we all? Let people's lives recover on their own, not according to the many modern economic assumptions about what we should do, right? It's entirely possible for people to restore their lives, even if an economic framework is ruined, people will still live. Do you believe that? Consider the case where our complex financial system can no longer be sustained. And let's compare the financial system to a car. In the modern capitalist era, finance is very important, like a nervous system, right? It's supposed to regulate the real economy in advance. But let's assume there's a financial crisis, and the financial car breaks down. What do? You get out and walk. Let the car go, we can still walk, right? Imagine in the West, if their financial car breaks down, they stay inside the car. Doing what? Trying to fix it, not moving forward. But according to the Chinese spirit, if the car breaks down, leave it behind and continue walking. It might be slower, but what's there to fear? The simplest method is what? To separate production and consumption from the entire complex financial system and let them interact directly. Where do production and consumption meet directly? At street stalls, in small shops, that's where they meet directly. People's lives will continue, and I firmly believe that the Chinese nation will not perish. Suppose the Pacific department store in Shanghai goes dark from the 1st to the 5th floor because of a break in the funding chain. Don't worry. In less than 2 months, there will be street stalls all around the Pacific department store on Huaihai Road. This is my reflection, and it's because we discussed the second point, the way of heaven lies in people's lives. The third point to discuss is the era. The way of heaven is not unchanging, it is present in the lives of the people, whose lives are always in a state of change. The Chinese believe that the world and the universe are constantly changing, and this force and master of change is the way of heaven. The way of heaven itself is a historical unfolding process, which distinguishes different eras. How are these eras distinguished? The way of heaven has different manifestations and ways of unfolding in different eras, which combined are known as the Tian Dao. The way of heaven's manifestation in an era is the fate of the people's lives during that era. For example, at the dawn of the modern era in Europe, during the late stages of the Christian era, a massive social transformation occurred. This was a new phase in the destiny of European nations, bringing about capitalism and scientific technology. This was the Tian Dao for Europeans. However, the Tian Dao for Europeans will certainly impose itself on non-European nations. Why? Because of the nature of capital. Capital originated in Europe, but it will inevitably break through Europe's borders. Why? What is capital? It is money that can multiply. If capital stops multiplying, it stops being capital. It's called a consumption fund, isn't it? Capital must keep multiplying to stay alive as capital. Thus, capital must continually multiply, which means it sees the consumption needs of people all over the world as its market, and the natural resources of the entire planet as its materials for multiplication. So, capital originated in Europe, but it is bound to break through Europe's borders and spread to non-European nation-states. Capital brought about an interconnected world. Before this, there was no world history, so to speak, only the isolated histories of various nations. So, they broke through Europe's borders and conquered the world. Globalization is inevitable. It is rooted in the logic of capital. Capital cannot remain within Europe's borders. Again, capital follows its own logic of multiplication, which means that for non-European nations, for Eastern nations, modernization has been forced. European countries were the original modernizing countries. We are the later modernizing countries, forced into the process of modernization. What does this mean? The destiny of the Chinese nation has changed. In the past, the Chinese had methods to predict the fate of a nation. For example, Shaoyong, 11th century CE, one of the 5 great thinkers of the Northern Song dynasty, wrote a book called Huangji Jingshi Lun. It was a system of divination derived from the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, the Book of Changes. We interpret an I Ching hexagram from 3 perspectives: its image, its principle, and its technique. Those who have studied the I Ching know that Confucius had provided the best interpretation of the hexagrams from the perspective of principle. Interpretation from the image and technique perspectives were also made in Shaoyong's book, which could be used to work out the fate of a nation. Although the book still exists, the specific techniques have been lost, and now it can only be studied as a philosophical text. Things are as they are, and even if the methods had not been lost, such calculations would be useless now because China has ended its isolationist state, right? China has joined the world system, both economically and politically. There's a saying known as the butterfly effect. The flapping of a butterfly's wings on one side of the ocean can cause a storm on the other side. This is a metaphor, but it's not untrue. The 2008 financial crisis originated on Wall Street in the United States, but it swept across the globe, and China could not avoid it. The crisis caused 60% to 70% of China's export-oriented manufacturing industry to lose orders, leading to an employment crisis. Starting from Shenzhen and moving up the coast to Dalian, these export-dependent manufacturers suddenly had no orders due to the financial crisis. Many migrant workers had to return home, a spectacular sight with hordes riding motorcycles, carrying their personal belongings, because there was no work left. This was a severe situation. Wen Jiabao was the premier at the time. Do you remember the significant decision made by the State Council? It was the implementation of a 4 trillion yuan stimulus package aimed at boosting infrastructure development, including high-speed rail, highways, and other infrastructure projects. The intention was to stimulate national investment and create more employment opportunities. Can we predict that scenario in our own national development? No, we cannot. Who knew that Wall Street would experience a financial crisis? Does it have anything to do with our national development? It doesn't, but it happened, right? Does it have a significant impact on us? Yes, it has a huge impact. Therefore, it is no longer possible to isolate a country's destiny and calculate it separately in today's world. The concept of eras is very important, especially considering the Shinyo-ku 1861 CE, launched by Empress Dowager Cixi to eliminate the 8 ministers. That took place in late Qing dynasty. When Emperor Xianfeng was on his deathbed, he entrusted the government to the 8 ministers to protect our country's system and its original rules, didn't he? Once those 8 ministers, led by Sushan, took power, Empress Dowager Cixi desired to grasp the supreme authority for herself. She initiated the coup. Some of the ministers were arrested, some were executed. The Shinyo coup is a significant turning point in modern Chinese history. After this coup, Chinese society entered a new phase, semi-feudal and semi-colonial. Foreign powers came in, and the nation's fate was no longer isolated. A new era had arrived. Therefore, as the Tian Dao presents different destinies in different ages, the concept of dividing these eras were established. Let's look at a character in Chinese, the shi as in world. Let's see how it is explained in the Shuowenjiezi, China's oldest dictionary. Duan Yukai, our 18th century scholar, annotated the character shi in Shuowenjiezi as follows: 30 years constitute one shi, and with it, the ways change. Seeing such an annotation, the first reaction is that the word shi corresponds precisely to the English word generation. For those who have learned English, the term generation means one generation of people, and 30 years make up one generation. So what is meant by ways change? It suggests that the direction of the world changes, doesn't it? Another way to say this is that the ways of the world change every 30 years. This reminds us of the saying, 30 years in the East, 30 years in the West. It is well known among the common people, and indeed, Duan Yucai's annotation is correct. Just looking at recent history makes this clear. After the 1919 May 4th movement, the main theme of Chinese social life, as Mao Zedong clearly stated, was to conquer the 3 big mountains, right? And later that was achieved. Then came 1949, after which the theme of Chinese social life was completely different from before. Isn't that so? Add 30 years to 1949, and you get to 1979. At the end of 1978, the 3rd plenary session of the 11th Central Committee started the era of reform and opening up, didn't it? So, the start was in 1979, with Shenzhen Special Economic Zone established in 1980, ushering in a new 30 years. That is to say, the new 30 years after the founding of the People's Republic began in 1979, a symbolic year. Then, adding 30 years to 1979 brings us to 2009. At the end of 2008, a meeting commemorating the 30th anniversary of the reform and opening up was held in Beijing, focusing on 3 no's: no wavering, no slackness, and no recklessness, right? If we can still remember, it was these 3 no's: no wavering, no slackness, and no recklessness. Why mention these 3 no's? You have to remove the no first, which leaves us with wavering, slackness, and recklessness. 2009 marked the end of the first 30 years of reform and opening up, and after 2009 began the subsequent 30 years, which we are still in. Add 30 years to 2009, and we arrive at 2039. Now we can discuss the division of eras. The division of eras is based on 2 criteria: first, the challenge of the era; second, the primary social contradiction. These two are the standards for the division of eras. In 1949, when the People's Republic of China was founded, what was the challenge of the era? It was about how to industrialize a country where over 90% of the population was involved in agriculture. The first stage of modernization is definitely industrialization. Without it, there is no modernization. An agricultural country needed to transform into one with an industrial system, an industrialized country. This was the challenge of the era after 1949. What path should an agricultural country take for industrial development from an economic perspective? Should it follow a planned economy or a market economy? If it were to follow the path of a market economy, could it establish an industrial system within a short time, within 30 years? It couldn't be done. An agricultural country with over 90% of its population in agriculture, aiming to engage in modernization and industrialization, signifies what? It means that within a short time, a large part of the population would need to shift from agricultural to industrial production. The first step is mining, then steel making, then machinery manufacturing, right? A considerable portion of the population would become industrial workers. They mine, they make steel, they manufacture machines. Can these products be eaten or worn? We can't eat steel or wear machinery, can we? But do these people need to eat and wear clothes? Yes. Who will provide for them? Only the farmers. So, how could farmers provide food and clothing for the significantly increased industrial population? If you unfold it through the means of a market economy, we know that China, as an agricultural country, has its natural villages and subsistence economy, right? Farmers are generally self-sufficient, they grow their food, weave cotton, and make clothes, self-sufficiently producing just a small surplus of agricultural products to exchange with the cities since this is a market economy. Could this small surplus of agricultural products exchanged with the cities support so many additional industrial workers? Impossible. What to do? The only solution is to reorganize farmers into collective production relations, starting with lower-stage collectives, later evolving into higher-stage collectives, also known as cooperatives, in 2 phases. After reaching the cooperative stage, the next step would be the people's communes, organizing farmers into people's communes, which would then trade with the cities. This exchange is not a market economy but a planned economy. The first era that began in 1949 was the era of the planned economy. Most of us here are quite young. As for me, I am now old, but what is my fortune? I have personally experienced these 2 eras. During the Mao Zedong era, we all know who was the highest role model for the working class. Wang Jinsi. And for the farmers? Chen Yonggui, right? This is the truth. These 2 figures, one from Daqing and the other from Dazai, right? They are the concentrated embodiment of the hard struggle of 2 generations of Chinese people, remarkable achievements. Without their tremendous efforts, there would be no cake to redistribute later, would there? So regarding the planned economy era, as we just mentioned, what was its main challenge of the era? Industrialization of an agricultural country. This is called the challenge of the era. So, what is the primary social contradiction? It is the contradiction between following the path of a planned economy or a market economy to achieve industrialization. Over 30 years, how did Mao Zedong express it? He referred to it as the struggle between 2 paths, the socialist road and the capitalist road, which he called the primary social contradiction. Mao Zedong's expression was accurate. At the 8th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, what was the primary social contradiction at that time? It was the contradiction between advanced social relations of production and the backward productive forces. Liu Shaoqi presided over the resolution of the 8th Congress, and Mao Zedong did not immediately oppose it at that time. Later on, however, He hesitated. Was this way of expressing it correct? Later, Mao Zedong realized it was not correct. The primary social contradiction is not the contradiction between the backward productive forces and the advanced production relations. This kind of contradiction is generally applicable to all eras since the productive forces are always insufficiently developed, right? To say this is almost to say nothing. The primary social contradiction is about which path to take, referred to as the struggle between two paths. Mao Zedong's assertion on this point is still correct and we look back at it today. That's all for this morning's lecture.